Story 1. I never believed in ghosts until I lived in that house on Maple Street. It was a quaint little place, nothing special from the outside. My wife and I had just moved to the area for my new job, and we were excited to start fresh in a new town. The rent was cheap and we didn't ask too many questions. Maybe we should have. The first few weeks were uneventful. We settled in, unpacked our boxes, and tried to make the place feel like home. Our neighbors, an older couple with a teenage son, kept to themselves. We'd wave if we saw each other outside, but that was about it. It was about a month in when I first heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from above, like something was scurrying across the ceiling. I brushed it off as maybe a squirrel or a raccoon that had found its way into the attic. But then I remembered, there was no attic access in our part of the house. I mentioned it to my wife, but she hadn't noticed anything. "You're probably just stressed from the new job," she said with a smile. "Try to relax." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The sounds continued, always at night, always when I was alone. Sometimes it was scratching, sometimes light thumps, as if someone was crawling around up there. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing every time I heard a noise. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the pipes or the house settling. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Something watching. One night, I woke up suddenly, drenched in sweat. The room was pitch black, but I could swear I saw something move in the corner of my eye. A shadow, darker than the darkness around it, seemed to flit across the ceiling. I blinked, and it was gone. But the feeling of being watched remained. I started to notice other things too. Sometimes I'd come home from work and swear things had been moved. Nothing big, just small things out of place. A book on the coffee table when I was sure I'd left it on the shelf. A mug in the sink that neither my wife nor I remembered using. My wife thought I was losing it. "You're working too hard," she'd say. "Maybe you should talk to someone." But I knew what I was experiencing was real. I became obsessed with trying to figure out what was going on. I'd stay up late listening for any sound, any hint of movement. I even bought a small camera and set it up in the living room, hoping to catch something on video. But every morning, the footage would show nothing but an empty room. The noises, the movements, the feeling of being watched, none of it ever showed up on camera. I started to doubt myself. Maybe I was going crazy. Maybe the stress of the move and the new job was getting to me more than I realized. I considered seeing a therapist, but I was afraid of what they might say. What if they thought I was delusional? Things came to a head one night in October. I was home alone, my wife away visiting her sister for the weekend. The scratching sounds had been particularly bad that night, keeping me from sleep. In a fit of frustration, I grabbed a broom and started banging on the ceiling, shouting for whatever it was to leave me alone. And then, for the first time, I heard a response. A muffled yelp, distinctly human, coming from above me. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a ghost. This was something much worse. I called the police immediately. They arrived within minutes, sirens blaring. I tried to explain what I'd heard, what I'd been experiencing for months. They looked skeptical but agreed to check it out. That's when we discovered the truth. There was a small hatch in the back of our neighbor's son's closet, hidden behind some boxes. It led to a crawl space that ran the length of both houses. The kid had been sneaking in there for months, watching us through tiny holes he'd drilled in the ceiling. The police found a whole setup up there. Snack wrappers, a sleeping bag, even a small camera of his own. The kid broke down and confessed everything. He'd been fascinated by the idea of spying on people, of having this secret world that no one else knew about. I felt sick. All those months of fear, of doubting my own sanity, and it had been this twisted kid's idea of fun. We moved out the next day. I couldn't stand the thought of staying in that house for another minute. My wife was horrified when she found out, apologizing over and over for not believing me, but I didn't blame her. Who would have guessed the truth? It's been years now, but I still think about that house sometimes, about how the mind can play tricks on you, make you believe in ghosts and monsters. But the reality can be so much scarier. I don't know what happened to the kid. I hope he got help. But sometimes, late at night, I still find myself looking up at the ceiling, listening for any sign of movement. And I wonder, how many other houses out there have secrets hiding in their walls? Story 2. I've never been able to look at ceiling fans the same way since that summer. It's been over 2 decades, but the memory still makes my skin crawl. I was 10 years old, spending the school holidays with my cousins in a small town called Millbrook, nestled in the heart of rural Victoria, Australia. My aunt and uncle lived in this big old Queenslander. You know, one of those houses on stilts with wraparound verandas and more rooms than they knew what to do with. It was the kind of place that creaked and groaned with every gust of wind, where shadows danced on the walls at night, cast by the gum trees outside. I was bunking in my older cousin Jake's room. He was away at uni in Melbourne, so his room was mine for the duration of our stay. At first, I thought it was cool. Posters of rock bands I'd never heard of, shelves lined with cricket trophies, and a massive window that looked out over the sprawling backyard. But then the dreams started. Every night, like clockwork, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. In my dreams, something was always reaching for me, a dark, writhing shape that seemed to ooze out of the shadows. I couldn't make out what it was exactly, but I knew it wanted to grab me, to pull me into the darkness. After a few nights of this, I was a wreck. Dark circles had formed under my eyes, and I jumped at every little sound. My parents noticed, of course. They tried to comfort me, told me it was just my imagination running wild in an unfamiliar place. My dad even checked under the bed and in the closet, like I was 5 years old again. "See? Nothing here, mate," he'd say with a reassuring smile. "Just your mind playing tricks on you." But I knew it wasn't just in my head. Something felt off about that room. During the day, it was fine. I'd play video games on Jake's old console or read comics on his bed. But as soon as the sun started to set, this feeling of dread would settle over me like a heavy blanket. My cousin Sarah, who was a year younger than me, tried to help. She lent me her nightlight, a cheap plastic thing shaped like a koala. "It keeps the monsters away," she whispered conspiratorially as she handed it to me. I didn't have the heart to tell her that whatever was haunting my dreams wasn't afraid of a glowing marsupial. As the days wore on, I started doing everything I could to avoid sleep. I'd sneak books and a torch under the covers, reading until my eyes burned. I'd play my Game Boy with the sound off, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. Anything to keep from closing my eyes and facing that thing again. It all came to a head on our last night there. I remember watching the digital clock on the bedside table, its red numbers seeming to mock me as they slowly ticked towards midnight. The house was silent, save for the occasional rumble of a distant storm. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe the storm getting closer, but then I heard it again, a soft scraping noise, like something rough being dragged across wood. My eyes darted around the room, trying to penetrate the darkness. The koala nightlight cast a weak, yellowish glow that did more to create shadows than dispel them. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, and I realized with growing horror that it was coming from above me. Slowly, terrified of what I might see, I lifted my eyes to the ceiling. And there, emerging from behind the lazily spinning ceiling fan, was a shape. In the dim light, I couldn't make out exactly what it was, but I saw movement. A slow, undulating motion that made my stomach churn. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was frozen in place, my voice caught in my throat. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, the shape grew longer, extending towards the bed. In that moment, my dream came rushing back to me, the dark, writhing thing reaching for me. But this was no dream. This was real. Just as the thing was about to touch the bed, a flash of lightning illuminated the room. In that brief, terrifying moment of clarity, I saw it. A massive snake, its scales glinting in the sudden light, its body partially coiled around the ceiling fan. That's when I found my voice. I screamed. I screamed like I'd never screamed before, a sound of pure, primal terror that ripped from my throat and echoed through the house. I leapt from the bed, scrambling backwards until I hit the wall, my eyes never leaving the massive reptile that was now quickly slithering down onto my bed. The house erupted into chaos. I heard running footsteps, shouting voices. The door burst open, light flooded the room, and suddenly my parents were there, along with my aunt and uncle. I was still screaming, pointing at the bed where the snake was now fully visible, its long body stretched out across the rumpled sheets. What happened next is a bit of a blur. I remember my uncle shouting for everyone to get out of the room. I remember being hugged tightly by my mom as I sobbed uncontrollably in the hallway. I vaguely recall my aunt on the phone, presumably calling for help. It turned out to be a carpet python, over 2 meters long. Harmless to humans, my uncle later explained, but terrifying nonetheless. It had been living in the ceiling, probably for years, coming down at night to hunt for mice or rats. The recent storm had likely disturbed its usual routine, causing it to venture further than usual. We left the next morning. I didn't sleep a wink that night, insisting on camping out in the living room with all the lights on. As we drove away, I caught one last glimpse of the old Queenslander in the rearview mirror. It looked so peaceful in the morning light, giving no hint of the terror it had held. Years have passed, but the memory of that night has never faded. I've developed a fear of snakes that no amount of reassurance or exposure therapy has been able to shake. Ceiling fans still make me nervous, and I always check the corners of my ceiling before going to bed. Sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I think about that python. Was it as scared as I was? Did it have any idea of the chaos it caused? Or was it just doing what came naturally, oblivious to the lasting impact it would have on one terrified kid? I'll never know the answers to these questions, but one thing's for sure. I'll never underestimate the power of a child's nightmare again, because sometimes, just sometimes, the monsters are real. Story 3. The Uninvited Guest. I've lived in Millbrook all my life, but I'll never forget the summer of '98. That was when the Thompson family moved into the old Victorian on Elm Street, and our sleepy little town got its first taste of real-life horror. The Thompsons seemed like your average family. John, the dad, worked at the local bank. Sarah, the mom, was a teacher at Millbrook Elementary. Their kids, Danny and Lisa, were typical teenagers, always glued to their Walkman and complaining about how boring our town was. They were nice enough, but kept to themselves mostly. Can't say I blame them. Millbrook isn't exactly known for rolling out the welcome wagon. It was about 3 months after they moved in that the whispers started. I worked at the grocery store back then, so I heard all the gossip. Sarah Thompson had been in, looking exhausted and frazzled, muttering something about missing food and moved furniture. At first, folks just chalked it up to the stress of moving to a new town. But as the weeks went by, the stories got weirder. One day, Lisa Thompson came into the store, her eyes red from crying. She was buying a new alarm clock, said her old one had vanished into thin air. "It was there when I went to sleep," she told me, her voice shaking. "And in the morning, it was just gone." That was just the beginning. Soon the whole town was buzzing with tales from the Thompson house. John's watch disappeared from his nightstand. Sarah's favorite sweater went missing from her closet. The living room furniture would be subtly rearranged overnight. The family swore up and down that they weren't doing it, and to be honest, they looked too terrified to be lying. Things came to a head about 6 months after the Thompsons moved in. It was a Sunday, and half the town was at the First Baptist Church when Sarah Thompson burst in, right in the middle of Pastor Mike's sermon. She was hysterical, babbling about shadows moving in her house and voices whispering in the night. Now, Millbrook's not the kind of place that goes in for all that ghostly nonsense. We're practical folk, more likely to blame a creaky floorboard on old wood than restless spirits. But something about Sarah's terror got to people. Before I knew it, half the congregation was at the Thompson house, led by Pastor Mike himself, ready to drive out whatever evil had taken up residence there. I tagged along out of curiosity and maybe a little concern. The Thompsons might have been newcomers, but they were still neighbors. When we got to the house, it was like walking onto the set of a horror movie. The family was huddled on the front lawn, pale and shaking. Inside, the house was a mess. Drawers pulled out, clothes strewn everywhere, furniture askew. Pastor Mike did his best, walking from room to room, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers. The rest of us tried to clean up, all the while jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. By the time we left, the place looked better, but the Thompsons still seemed on edge. Sarah kept glancing at the ceiling, like she expected something to come crashing through at any moment. For a while after that, things seemed to calm down. The gossip at the grocery store turned to other matters, and I didn't see much of the Thompsons. I figured whatever had been going on had sorted itself out. Maybe it had just been new house jitters after all. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Tuesday, unseasonably warm for October. I remember because I was sweating through my uniform, cursing the store's broken AC. The bell over the door jingled, and in walked Danny Thompson, looking like he'd seen a ghost. He made a beeline for the payphone in the corner, remember those? And dialed 911. I couldn't hear everything he said, but I caught enough. Break-in. Someone in the house. Hurry. By the time I'd ushered the other customers out and locked up the store, half of Millbrook's police force, all three of them, were screaming towards Elm Street, sirens blaring. I probably should have stayed put, but curiosity got the better of me. By the time I got to the Thompson house, a crowd had already gathered. The scene was chaos. John and Sarah Thompson were on the front lawn, holding each other and sobbing. Lisa was sitting on the curb, a blanket around her shoulders, staring blankly into space. And being led out of the house in handcuffs was a man I'd never seen before. He was tall and gaunt, with wild eyes and a scraggly beard. His clothes were filthy and hung off him like rags. As the cops pushed him into the back of a squad car, he kept yelling, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean no harm. I was just so hungry." The story came out in bits and pieces over the next few days. The man's name was Frank Holloway. He'd been a drifter, passing through Millbrook on his way to nowhere in particular. One night, desperate for shelter, he'd broken into the Thompson house while the family was out. He'd only planned to stay the night, but when he discovered the unlocked attic, he saw an opportunity. For 6 months, Frank had been living in the Thompsons' attic. He'd come down when the family was out, eating their food, using their shower, even watching their TV. When he needed money, he'd take small items to sell in the next town over. He'd been careful, so careful. But in the end, a simple mistake had been his undoing. He'd fallen asleep on the living room couch and hadn't heard Danny coming home early from school. The town was in shock. How could this happen here, in Millbrook? We'd always left our doors unlocked, trusted our neighbors. Now people were installing security systems, eyeing strangers with suspicion. The Thompsons put their house up for sale not long after, eager to put the whole ordeal behind them. As for Frank, he went to jail, of course. But sometimes I wonder about him. What kind of desperation drives a man to live in a stranger's attic? How lonely must he have been, listening to a family's life going on below him? Always separate, always an outsider? It's been years now, but I still think about that summer sometimes. When I hear a floorboard creak in the night or notice something out of place in my house, I get a chill down my spine. I know it's probably nothing, just the house settling or my own forgetfulness. But then I remember the Thompsons, and I go check my attic just to be sure. Because if there's one thing I learned from that summer, it's that sometimes the thing going bump in the night isn't a ghost. Sometimes it's something much more real and much more frightening. Sometimes the monster in your house is all too human.
Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.